Hello, welcome to day 3 of the International Trade and Prosperity Week at the ICC United Kingdom. We are talking all about sustainability and climate change, and today we are focusing on human rights for our final session. Before we make a start, I just wanted to thank some of our sponsors and supporters for the event, whilst people are logging on to the system and in advance. Thank you to ESG 360 and Halion, who have sponsored the event this year. We couldn't do it without their financial support, so very much grateful to them. We also like to thank Diageo, who hosted day 1 of the conference in person, which was on Tuesday. I think a great night was had by all, with Diageo providing some very nice cocktails at the end of the evening. So thank you to those as well. I just wanted to mention we have launched an ICC toolkit all on sustainability, climate change, which is some really useful information, case studies, thought leadership from across the network. I do encourage you to look at the QR code, use your cameras to download it, but Sonia from our policy coordinator, who looks after our energy and environment committee, she'll be making sure that the link to the toolkit is in the chat room for you to download as well. It's a very useful tool that was only recently announced this week. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Moira Thompson Oliver, who is Senior Counsel and Head of Business and Human Rights at Slaughter & May, one of our long-standing members. Moira, over to you.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to the last session of the 3rd day of International Trade and Prosperity Week. As has already been said, for the next hour we're going to be exploring the links between human rights and climate change. I don't think anyone needs me to say that climate change is one of the gravest threats to human rights the world has ever encountered, and the fundamental rights to life, health, food, and an adequate standard of living already being impacted by the effect that climate change is having on temperature, water systems, nature, and agricultural production. So with our fantastic panel here today, we're going to be delving deeper into the roles and responsibilities of business and policymakers to address the problem. So speakers are going to discuss the link between climate change and human rights, whether there's a need for greater ambition on mitigation and adaptation. We're going to be looking at the mechanisms that can drive change to protect human rights, including the adequacy of existing soft law frameworks and also the many regulatory developments that we're seeing. So I'm delighted to be joined today by John Morrison from the Institute for Human Rights and Business, where he's Chief Executive, Peter Nestor, Global Head of Human Rights at Novartis, a leading global pharmaceuticals manufacturer, and Carlo Drauth, Head of Responsible Business and Human Rights at the telecoms company Telefonica. Now I'm just going to hand over briefly to our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we're going to kick off. So, John.
Hey, thanks, Moira. Hello, everybody. I'm John Morrison. I lead a global think and do tank on business and human rights established 14 years ago by Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, former High Commissioner for Human Rights. We're currently chaired by Margot Wallström, the former Foreign Minister of Sweden, and I'm the CEO, and we've been working on the climate human rights interface now for the past 3 years, and I'll talk a bit about that. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Peter?
Hi, everyone. My name is Peter Nestor. I lead the Human Rights Program at Novartis, which is a large pharmaceutical company. Prior to joining Novartis, I've been there for 4 years. Prior to that, I worked on business and human rights, advising companies across a range of industries at a nonprofit based in the US called BSR. It's a privilege to be here today. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Carlo?
Hello, everyone. My name is Carlo Drauth, and work as Head of Responsible Business and Human Rights at Telefonica. For those that are not familiar with Telefonica, we are one of the bigger telecommunications operators with presence in Europe and South America. Here in the UK, for instance, the brand you might know is Virgin Media O2. Within Telefonica, my team is responsible for the group's sustainability due diligence process. So we are constantly working with other corporate functions within Telefonica, such as procurement operations, but also with our national subsidiaries to ensure that we have the adequate policies and processes in place to address potential and actual human rights and environmental impacts. Yeah, great to be here. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everyone. So first of all, we're going to start getting into the different responsibilities between business and government in addressing the human rights impacts of climate change. And particularly in the run-up to COP28, I think it's really helpful for us to think about policy making in this area. So, John, you personally and your organisation has deep experience in both human rights and climate change, and you particularly looking at issues of just transition. I saw that you brought out a report on just transition in the banking sector recently, for example. Could you just sort of lay out the landscape for us and tell us a bit about civil society perspective on how to manage the human rights impacts of a net zero transition, and how do you think that differs from government's perspectives or indeed business perspectives as well?
Thanks, Moira. We've been attending COP meetings as an official observer since COP26. I have to say there's probably not that many human rights organizations have observer status within the COP process. There are a few. There isn't one civil society perspective. If you talk to NGOs in the Global South, in the G77, or indigenous NGOs, or climate activists, or worker groups, or youth-based intergenerational perspectives, they will agree on some things and disagree on others. So there isn't a civil society perspective. But it's worth noting that human rights is in the preamble to the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, and therefore human rights should cross-cut every single issue in the climate agenda. I would say, however, that it's largely been embedded in the mitigation discussion. We'll talk about just transition in a minute, I think. There's a big push from the Global South that more money and attention is given to adaptation. And if we think about agriculture in particular, but other sectors, that is very much a human rights question. Two, a lot of attention since Egypt last year on loss and damage. And if you've been following the news this week, there is a bit of an agreement around the loss and damage fund agreed in Abu Dhabi. But civil society very unhappy, I think, that it's parked with the World Bank, which of course is dominated by northern donors, and the sort of business as usual fear that I think Global South organizations have there. I think there's also been a bit of a feeling to keep social issues out of the climate negotiations for a long time. Science-based targets are really important. The problem there has been the people who've been talking about social complexity around climate transition have been the climate deniers, and those people who are trying to slow down the process or derail the process. We do now see, and we'll see this at COP28, where a whole day has been set aside for just transition, and understanding that social complexity, social impacts, human rights have to be absorbed into the transition planning process. Otherwise, the process itself will be derailed. And the new chair of the International Panel on Climate Change, Professor Jim Skier, has said that social opposition to transition is now one of the biggest challenges we face in reaching net zero by 2050. So I think there's a coming together now and more opportunity perhaps to talk about human rights within climate. I'll come back and talk about just transition in the next section, but there's some initial thinking, some observations. More. Thanks.
Thank you. So Peter, Carlo, moving to you. You're both in companies which have embraced soft law frameworks for many years now, which set out responsibilities of governments and business. Do you think that the conversations now need to move on, or are moving on, to think about climate change and human rights together? John has talked about sort of resistance of bringing social issues into the conversations at the various COPs. Do you see that companies are now starting to think about them not as two separate pillars of ESG, so environmental, social, and governance, but actually starting to join it together in their thinking? So I'd like to hear from you both about how your organisations are thinking about that, and in particular the sort of practical challenges of doing so, because I think that's really important to get to some of the practicalities, particularly for policymakers to hear. So perhaps Peter, you first, Global Head of Human Rights at Novartis, operating a huge number of jurisdictions, I presume. So how are you thinking about the two issues together, or maybe you're not yet? Tell us about where you are in that process.
Yeah, thanks, Moira. We are thinking about the two issues together, but it's still relatively early days. I think for a long time, the focus has been on carbon reduction programs or maybe some mitigation programs where there is some a risk of impacts from climate change. But really, for the first time over the last couple of years, we started to think about them together, and that's created some challenges. And then maybe I can talk a little bit about what we have done from a very pragmatic standpoint when we do our risk assessments and due diligence on this. So when we look at problems from a broad human rights standpoint, the framework that we go to is the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. That's the current international standard. And the way we analyze the problems are to look and first identify where the harm is. So who has suffered human rights harm? And then we look to see whether a company has caused that harm, whether they've contributed to it, or whether they are quote unquote directly linked. And these are some kind of technical terms in the guiding principles. I won't go into too much detail in them, only to say that when we look at climate change, we have two ways that we can look at it. One is from a carbon emissions and therefore carbon reduction standpoint. So if we say that there is somebody living in, let's say, a farmer in Peru who has suffered negative harm from climate change, from excessive flooding, is it possible to link emissions from our manufacturing facilities around the world, historical emissions that have contributed something to climate change? Is it possible to link our emissions down to that particular farmer and say we owe that farmer some kind of a remedy and that community some kind of a remedy based on our past emissions? That is a very complicated, probably impossible task to look at, and one that is going to require an entire generation to come up with a good approach there. I doubt that we will ever see an approach where one company or one entity or even one country is linked to actual harm with on a particular individual based on past climate emissions. I think, more to John's point, there will need to be some sort of a fund set up that everyone is contributing to in some kind of a reasonable way that accounts for the total emissions from either the company or the country where they were producing. So we take that and we set it aside. We say, all right, there's another approach that we could take here, and that is on the mitigation and adaptation side. To say climate change is happening. We know that this will present some heightened risk in places where we do business. Let's look at the potential human rights impact. So last year, for the first time, we conducted a human rights impact assessment of our climate risk, and we mapped out all of our operational sites. So not all of our offices, but where we actually have factories or are manufacturing medicine. We have 18 sites around the world. We then identified what the potential climate change impacts are on those sites. And we identified 4: flooding, extreme heat, water stress, and harm from cyclones or hurricanes. Obviously, those bring human rights impacts: the right to life, access to clean water, right to housing, right to food, right to healthcare. And then we needed to assess whether any of our 18 sites actually had some open risk here. And we found that 5 of our sites did, ones that we had in India, Brazil, Egypt, and China. So then the question is, what do we do and who do we protect? We looked at it initially from the standpoint of protecting our own employees, where we had the most control and the most ability to make sure that our operations could continue, but also that people within our own operations were safe. So for flooding risks, for example, we want to make sure that there are good evacuation plans in place. People are set up to work remotely at home. What we also wanted to make sure to do is make sure that any of our mitigation programs didn't cause greater harm for another group. So if we set up flood defenses, for example, around one of our factories, we want to make sure that we're not diverting flooding water into a neighboring community or someone else's backyard. So we want to make sure that we're not causing more harm by trying to mitigate this harm. With excessive heat, we were looking for good cooling systems, water availability. And again, if we're going to take a mitigation step to move operations to night or move a lot of our shifts to nighttime when it's cooler and easier for people to work, we then need to think about public transportation, how people get to work, and making sure that we're protecting people who are transporting to work now at night versus during the day. where there might be water stress problems. We have a lot of existing programs where we are already trying to reduce the water that we use in our manufacturing, and so maybe there's a little bit more that we could do there. And I think that's an open conversation that we are having. I guess let me just end on one note and then pass it over to Carlo. I think part of the trick here, I sort of emphasized that we're focused on our employees now, but I'm not 100% sure that's where we should stop or can stop. The human rights framework gets a little bit more ambiguous and a little bit tricky as we start to go outside of our own operations. But I think there is an opportunity to engage more with local governments to say, is there anything that we can do to help you if there's a major flood or a cyclone that happens here? I know there was one company in California recently with some of the fires in Northern California where they were helping the firefighters either by providing firefighting equipment that they had stockpiled or providing a safe space for people to go to. I'm not quite ready yet to say that that is a human rights obligation that we have, but it certainly is being a good neighbor, and it certainly is, I think, trying to do the right thing and engage and try to help the broader community wherever we can.
Thank you, Peter. You touched on some really interesting points here about the sort of adequacy of existing software frameworks and analysis, and I think also that there's problem which we'll come back to. So we're going to come back to that when we talk about regulatory change, and also the issue around, do you cause more harm by trying to avoid harm, which is intimately connected with the just transition issue. So, Carlo, turning to you, I was really impressed to see that Telefonica has actually published its first human rights and environmental assessment. I have to say, not many companies actually publish those internal assessments, so it's great to see that. Could you just sort of outline for us a little bit more about your thinking as an organization and why you did it, any practical challenges that you encountered in doing that assessment together? So bringing the social and the environmental issues together as we've been talking about.
Yes, of course. Maybe a few words first on our motivation. So on your question as to what led to this publication. To be honest, when we started the project, our primary intent was not so much to publish a report in the end, but it was rather business as usual. We conduct impact assessments on a regular basis for a decade already to identify those salient issues, those potential impacts that we need to address through our due diligence process. The novelty last year, though, was, as you said, that for the first time, we did not just conduct a human rights impact assessment, but a human rights and environmental impact assessment. And the reasons for doing so were manifold. First and foremost, there are, as you rightly pointed out, obvious connections between human rights and climate. I mean, if you want to address these issues in an adequate way, you have to also think them together. Also another reason was, and this was to be very honest, a response to the regulatory stakeholder discourse on that matter, that when we started the project, that we already had the EU proposal for the corporate sustainability due diligence directive in our hands. So it was clear that the expectation will be also at the regulatory level to address human rights and environmental issues together in a holistic approach. So these were basically the reasons why we decided to address these two issues together. And it all made a lot of sense in theory. The truth is, though, that in practice, the analysis, first and foremost, I would say, because we applied prioritization criteria taken from the UN Guiding Principles, so scope, scale, remediability, to non-human rights issues. In the human rights field, obviously, I mean, we have more than a decade of experience using these criteria. But for our environmental colleagues, this approach was new and in practice challenging when having to determine, for example, the severity, probability of issues like biodiversity. Another challenge was, it actually still is one that we have to work on in our next impact assessment, is to better visually present, communicate our results, especially these interdependencies between these issues, between human rights and climate, because a two-dimensional severity probability matrix, you still rather look at the relative priority of issues, thus treating them rather separately and not, you do not sufficiently explore the relationships between them. Having said that, we're still glad that we did the project the way we did. We learned quite a lot, are now implementing the learnings in our policies and processes, and will hopefully do an even better job in the next impact assessment. Maybe just a last word on why we decided to publish the report. During the impact assessment, we talked obviously to right holders, stakeholders, since you can only assess impact when you talk to the ones potentially impacted, or at least with some of the proxies like NGOs, etc. So the universal feedback was that transparency and impacts and ways to address them is key. So for this first time also we published a more extensive summary of the analysis, and I invite you all to read the report and provide me with some feedback on the things you like and also things that you think we can do better.
Thank you, Carlo. So interesting to hear about the challenges, and I think Peter talked about this as well, as sort of using the UN Guiding Principles framework, which is the accepted sort of international standard in terms of analysing corporates' obligations to respect human rights. And I think, it's fair to say that a lot of companies that have been working with the UN Guiding Principles in relation to human rights, there have been challenges. We're still thinking about appropriate remedies, but when you try and apply it to the climate situation as well, I think that what I'm hearing from you both is that it's presenting real challenges. I think let's think then about where we're going from a policy and regulatory perspective, because it's fair to say that there are a number of emerging standards on climate and material, thinking about double materiality or single materiality, whether it's the ISSB, the EU regulations, transition planning in the UK. I think it's obviously great to see, that this regulatory, I wouldn't say kind of movement quite yet, but we have pockets of developments in this area, which hopefully will bring more clarity for business as to what they need to do. But I'd really like to get your perspective on whether you think that is going to happen. We talked about how it's very difficult working with the soft law framework. Do you think that the regulatory developments are going to lead to clarity and also, most importantly, effect change? So I think, John, I'm going to start with you. Do you think, I'm not sure we could talk for a very long time at this point, but we'll try and keep it brief, but do you think this is more of a moving in the sort of box ticking direction, or do you actually think that this is going to stimulate corporate action? How optimistic are you?
I think in the short term, it's going to create confusion, but importantly so, perhaps. There's three buckets, I guess, to the regulation. There's the mandatory due diligence pieces that are coming out of Europe, particularly. There's the reporting disclosure-led stuff. And then there's the trade-related stuff around forced labor, sanctions, etc. Now, all of those are coming together in different ways. Some are stronger on climate, some are stronger on human rights. So there's that element. I think there's a danger. The French law, perhaps the Loi de Vigilance in France, is one of the longest standing bits of mandatory human rights due diligence legislation we have. And arguably that has created a bit of a compliance culture in France. Board level, boards rarely see the due diligence plans that are produced by French companies. And it requires civil society to police and take civil action. The German one is very different, right? And so a lot depends, I think, where the European Union comes down. Does it come down closer to the German model than the French? And indications are that it probably will. That will help, of course, consolidate things. But at the end of the day, in the next 5 years, I think there are going to be two things that really drive corporate behavior here. One is what you could call corporate transition plans. What are we talking about? We're talking about everything, everywhere, all at once. So sometimes companies say, well, if we're doing good human rights due diligence, aren't we ready for this? Well, yes and no, because due diligence is often done at a project level, site level, or country risk analysis. We're talking about the whole global economy shifting in the next 25 years from high to low carbon. No one has seen this before. So corporate transition plans are going to be essential to navigate the pinch points that companies will face. And the way that this will materialize in the boardroom is not a piece of law on its own, but it will be, oh my God, we can't get hold, our supply chain is in a mess. There's consumers are demanding this, we can't get hold of this commodity, etc. As we get into a more fractured trading environment around the world with conflicts that we're very aware of, all of these things play in together. So I think corporate transition planning around particular strategic pinch points is one aspect, and then the board level oversight of that. We're going to see more focus on climate governance at board level. And there, I think it's fundamentally about systems analysis. What boards need are people that can think not just longer term, but from a systems perspective, and therefore integrate climate and human rights expertise together, as well as other considerations. So I think the board level piece and the transition planning piece is going to be the corporate response over the longer term. And the pieces of law that we're seeing, which I think are helpful, and I think we need more and more coherence internationally, will just be one factor within that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So, Peter, I think picking up on some of the themes that you were mentioning before, and also John was saying around, the real practical impacts this is going to have on companies. If your supply chain is impacted, that's going to have real world impact for companies. So at that sort of systems and operational level, but also sort of the need for thinking at the board level, and perhaps that strategic and the systems analysis that John was talking about. Do you think that in the work that you've undertaken, and I think when you're speaking, first of all, you were talking about some of the challenges of mitigation. Is it mitigation you should focus on, or adaptation? What sort of responsibilities? Some of those more sort of bigger questions. How are you trying to close those sort of gaps in your understanding? Tell us a bit more about some of those challenges.
Yeah, I think, and let me just pick up on a couple of points that John made, because I think they're really important as we start to see more regulation here, and we see in the current version of the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive in the EU, that there is an overlap, a requirement to link together human rights and climate change and other environmental issues. And I think to some extent, we all say that's probably a good thing. It forces a conversation that we're not having. It forces some due diligence that we're currently not doing. And we find some interesting things. Anytime, to Carlo's point, anytime you engage with stakeholders on the ground, understand better the harm that they could potentially be facing, you will come up with some interesting ways to solve those problems, some of which I gave an example of earlier. I guess what I'm worried about is kind of this existential problem that John described. Is this regulation actually helping us to solve the problem, which is that we need to move an entire planet from one source of energy to another? And I'm just worried that, it's going to feel a little bit like being in the orchestra as the Titanic is sinking. We're all going to feel really good about the mitigation plans that we have in place. Yay, we linked up human rights and climate change, but we have no more country or factory or location where we can actually provide medicine to people. So I guess I'm a little bit worried about that. And I've seen some concerning examples from the business and human rights field, I guess, just to be a little bit provocative here. I would point to the UK Modern Slavery Act as one, which on the one hand, again, it's great. You have the conversation about modern slavery and supply chains. Every company has it. Novartis is no different. We have to put out a modern slavery report every year. Is that the number one human rights risk for our company? It is not. Do we end up putting a lot of resources behind that one particular issue because this law requires us to do it, and therefore sacrificing those resources where we might have more impact? We do, because we're legally required. And so I think, again, just taking on John's call for more coherent legislation, or perhaps legislation that takes a broader view of what the real problem is and what the real impact is that we all need to drive, and then can help steer companies at the board level. I think that will ultimately get us a lot farther than simply linking up a conversation between climate and human rights.
Yeah, so this is around, I think, the need for coherence. Carlo, I'm going to come to you to to give your experience of this as well, because when you did the impact assessment, did you find that issue of how sort of wide to cast the net, what scope was, how to join the two issues together as a significant issue, or did it? I mean, I know you said there's some challenges, certainly in taking the UN Guiding Principles rubric and applying it with the environmental hat on, but tell us a bit more whether any of these sort of issues resonate for you as well.
Yeah, definitely. They do resonate. And also, I mean, what is, I think, very interesting and also important to understand is the distinction also between, for example, the human rights and environmental impact assessment I explained earlier, and also the materiality analysis that you alluded to a couple of minutes ago. Because I mean, we are currently conducting our double materiality analysis, and we already tried to conduct our analysis in such a way that it is aligned with the ESRS requirements, even though it only applies to us next year. And I mean, it is important, I think, to understand here also the difference between the two exercises, the impact assessment and the materiality analysis, because there are two different exercises. An impact assessment basically helps a company to prioritize action to address human rights and environmental issues, while a materiality analysis determines which sustainability information you should, as a company, publicly disclose. Yeah. Having said that, I mean, these two exercises are obviously connected, and you should also, in a company, link them. And this is, I think, a good point about the legislation, because I do see some sort of policy coherence, at least at the European level. The ESRS, for example, explicitly states that the materiality analysis of a negative impact should be informed by the due diligence process. Yeah? So what this means basically is that you should use the results of your impact assessment as an input for your materiality analysis. And this is what we are currently doing also at Telefonica. And we think it makes perfect sense, because these two processes, even though they're different in nature, they must be aligned, because it would be strange if your impact assessment says, for instance, that the responsible use of artificial intelligence is a salient issue, but you do not report on it as it did not pass the materiality test. Yeah. So this is why we are currently trying to marry these two exercises. It's again, there are a lot of challenges involved, practical, technical challenges, but I think it's worthwhile in the end, because also, as what Peter said earlier, it brings people together also within the organization. Yeah, because often, like, the distinct sustainability professions within a company tend to overfocus on their specific topics. So the human rights ones, the climate ones, health and safety, procurement, reporting, etc. But given this policy coherence at least European level, and to some extent also at international level, we need to work more closely together. And this is definitely necessary also to address potential negative impacts. Maybe just one last word, basically of caution with regard to the materiality analysis also, because I think we as companies, we do not live up to our responsibility to respect human rights if we adopt such a, let's say, regulatory checkbox mentality and limit ourselves to just report all the required ESRS data points. Yeah? Because don't get me wrong, reporting is necessary, but it is really insufficient to achieve impact. Yeah, I mean, what I want to say is that reporting and actions, they are two different things. Yeah, sustainability actions, they can lead to reporting, but reporting can also uncover the need for action. However, reporting can also simply be reporting, and you might end up with lots of disclosures, metrics, calculations, etc., but you lack substantive sustainability action. So I think this is why I think we as companies, we should try to follow rather the spirit of the law instead of the latter, in pursuit of a broader strategy impact when it comes to the new legal reporting requirements.
Thank you, Carlo. And I think very, very important reflections. I think in this, we've talked a bit about, John talked about the need for systems thinking at a board level. And I think Peter and Carlo, you both talked about how, sort of challenge of resources. So again, maybe this is a board level issue to make sure that appropriate resources are in place to address the issues. But importantly, as you were saying, Carlo, that we don't just set up different teams, but everyone is working together. And I think you touched nicely, Carlo, on the need for action outside of the regulatory framework. Just obviously regulatory frameworks are important in driving disclosure, etc. But a sense of a bigger way of thinking. And Peter, you were touching on this earlier, I think, around think about historic impacts and accountabilities of companies for historic impacts. But also, John, your organization has done a lot of thinking about future generations. So are these issues of broader accountability, are they ones which companies should be addressing? Do companies need to be thinking about just transition issues? And John, maybe you can sort of explain your thinking on what those mean in a moment, or should they be sort of more focusing on the practical aspects, and through those regulatory exercises, through thinking about supply chains and impacts and the operational issues that will get there anyway. So maybe a bit of a big theme, but John, I'm going to ask you to have a go at tackling that one first.
Well, companies should definitely be focusing on transition issues, right? Because whichever way you look at the world, in the next 25 years, we're going to see huge amounts of disruption, not just because of climate and biodiversity and environmental degradation, but mass migration, conflict, fracturing global trade, etc. Right? So for a company that doesn't think about transition won't exist in 25 years' time. I could say that quite confidently.
I'm sure. I'm just going to check that, because I think that is right. But I think where do you think just transition?
Well,
the word just. You're coming on to that.
Right onto that.
Okay.
Because justice applies to all of these types of transition, right? We've codified it a bit in relation to climate, where particularly the ILO declaration in relation to workers and jobs and green jobs and things. But it is a bigger concept than that, right? Because transitions will be happening in very complex ways. Transitions only the other thing about transition is they only make sense in local context. So it doesn't matter what systems you have in place as a company. If the communities or the workers in a locality do not think the transition has been just, do not feel it has been just, then it hasn't been just, right? And you're going to lose social license, and you're going to focus, you're going to get operation, you're going to get challenges, legal challenges on that basis. So there's a heavily contextual element to transitions too. So although I've said you need corporate transition plans, you need board oversight, but where the rubber hits the road is understanding how this works within particular business sectors and particular geographies. However, that doesn't mean cultural relativism. The work we've done bringing experts together from around the world is there are 4 key elements that are essential to a just transition process. And if one of these elements is missing, then you have to ask yourself why. The first is the due diligence, the do no harm, risk mitigation piece, which you'll find in the UNGPs. We've talked about that. The second is beneficial outcomes for the workers and communities and your supply chains, etc., through the transition process, that that there's an incentive for them to transition to in terms of their own livelihoods and work. The third is what I would call procedural rights. So the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous people, which matter given 54% of all these transition commodities are in Indigenous lands. So in the rights of Indigenous peoples is going to come really center stage in the next few years. But the free, the collective bargaining of workers and other procedural issues, as well as justice, right, and how that works. The fourth one, which we rarely hear in the global north, but when you're in the global south, this is the one you hear the most, is transformation. Is that whatever green economy we move to in the next 25 years, that poorer countries in the world are not at the bottom of global value chains in the way they have been the past 200 years. And honestly, you can't talk about a just transition in West Africa telling people to forgo natural gas if they're going to lock themselves into a green hydrogen value chain where they're the bottom of the value chain again. So this issue of economic transformation is integral. And this is why, it's impossible to talk about loss and damage at the global level without talking about the reform of the World Bank at the same time. Global South countries, stakeholders are not going to accept business as usual around international climate finance. And I think we're going to see that in all aspects of the transition. So those four components are absolutely essential, I'd say. And if in your own corporate transition planning, one of those is missing, I would always say, well, ask yourself why. Why is that factor missing from our own work? Thank you.
Thank you, John, and great food for thought there. I think, Peter, you touched in your presentations on, I don't think you called it transformation, but you certainly talked about local communities and the importance of context. What's the perspective of your organisation in relation to just transition and maybe some of those 4 points that John has laid out?
Yeah, thanks. Just transition is one of these terms that you see a lot. It's got a little bit of a buzzword feel to it, but it's kind of slippery and hard to pin down. I really appreciated your exposition there, John, and I sort of taking notes, and I think that tracks with exactly how I'm thinking about or seeing the just transition play out. So starting with workers, right, making sure that anybody who's moving from, say, a coal mining job to a solar panel manufacturing job, that those jobs are available, that they are also good jobs, and that they're accepted within that community. New energy sources that we'll be using will require human rights due diligence, especially because so many of them require rare earth minerals or conflict minerals, or those types of operations, mining operations in countries where things like FPIC, like you mentioned, John, are sometimes not stable. There has been this, and we'll need to do that due diligence, I should say. There's this really big question then about intergenerational justice, about how countries organize themselves to pay for the harm that other countries and people in those countries have suffered. I haven't seen the outlines even of a framework that would get us there, but I hope the generation behind me can help sort that out, and I'm sure they'll have every incentive to. And then the economic transformation is really interesting, and something I think we need to look at a little bit more. I would just say very candidly, as one company, these issues feel like they float at kind of a 30,000, 40,000 foot level, whereas we tend to look more at the 10,000 foot level of what's going to happen within our own operations. I don't think we're going to be able to continue to do that. And I think as we map out the next phase of our work on climate and human rights, taking back these four areas, thinking about just transition a little bit more carefully and doing some actual due diligence there and trying to work with others to understand what that might look like will be on my to-do list.
Can you say, Peter, I think it's a really important point about we've got to keep that 30,000 foot level, is our guiding light really in terms of thinking about the bigger picture, but we also have to be practical. And could you say that, because we're talking in this session a lot about the role of policymakers here and governments. How can governments help businesses like Novartis to bring it down to that level, to create the right incentives? What's your perspective on that? Because we talked a lot about business responsibilities, which undoubtedly we're not shying away from, but this is part of a whole ecosystem, as John was talking about at the beginning.
Yeah, I think it's to help provide clarity where there is not a good understanding of what the actual impacts are or the potential risks are, either to individuals and people in communities or to the business operations themselves. So, a law that requires us to start thinking about human rights in a just transition or human rights and climate change triggers that conversation, and it forces us to start having these conversations internally about what exactly this means for our company. We then chat with other companies in our industry. How are you all thinking about this? We can then chat with other industries. How are you all thinking about these particular issues? What are you finding? What approaches are working for you? At the end of the day, I think companies want to know what decisions they need to make that will have an impact, hopefully a positive impact in these types of areas. And the more that map can be drawn, the easier it is for companies then to follow that map and actually do what they're supposed to do. So to the extent that governments can help provide that clarity through legislation and coherence through legislation, I think that's really helpful. I think some engagement with business and with other stakeholders here might be really helpful. We saw extensive engagement from John Ruggie and his team in the guiding principles. And I think that's partly why they were able to take off and grab so many companies that said, all right, we've weighed in on this. We had a chance to express what would be very difficult and what we think we can do. Same with civil society and same with governments. I don't feel like we've quite had that level of engagement yet on climate and human rights. And I think we're ripe for it.
Yeah. And I think, but just before I come back to you, Carlo, I think I just wanted to ask John on that, because you said right at the very beginning that there is no sort of single civil society view, quite rightly. I was sort of putting civil society and business in, and we'll come on, I think, in a minute to talking about businesses which aren't huge, like Telefonica and Novartis, what they can do. But I think I'm picking that civil society perspective and the fact that there is no single perspective, John. And the very important point that Peter has made about stakeholder engagement. We need to get stakeholders together. How do you see this happening? You've said that there is incremental progress in COP28 in terms of having a day addressed to this. But are there any other things that you could suggest that would be helpful in building that level of engagement?
Definitely, and I think it's bottom up, right? So as I've said, just transition, if it's anything, it has to be place-based, but based in a particular place and in a particular time frame, right? Otherwise it becomes meaningless quickly. And therefore we're talking not about stakeholders in a generic way, we're talking about affected stakeholders within particular localities. And of course, some sectors have done this. Mining companies have done this for a long time. But everyone's going to have to do this, right? Around all business operations. Of course, it gets more complicated if we talk about consumers, right? I mean, or patients in relation to a pharmaceutical company, who you can't, maybe you've got millions of patients around the world for a particular drug. Who then do you talk to? And what are the legitimate ways of doing that? But it does come back to what I would call social license at the end of the day. And as justice in the eye of the beholder, right? Regardless of what systems and laws are in place. We know this from demonstrations we see around the world on many different issues. If people don't feel that justice is seen to be done, and if justice is not done, then people will block access to assets, will demonstrate, will strike, will etc. So we need to get a lot better at place-based mechanisms, place-based ways of engaging with real people and real lives. And I do think that's been perhaps a limitation over the past 15, 20 years in business and human rights world, when we've been moving from Geneva to New York and John Ruggie's work, and then which is very, very important. Frameworks, very important. But at the end of the day, we're judged by how this impacts people's lives. So I think good examples of how this works at a local level that can be shared. There's no cut and paste. Each context is different, but there's a lack, I think, as well as a lack of clarity around laws, there's a lack of clarity about what really works, and communities themselves talking about the benefits they've experienced through transition processes. And I've seen a few of these beginning to come forward, whether from trade unions or just from communities themselves. That's the stuff that people are going to believe, right? People in the world today don't believe experts, apparently, but what they do believe is people like them. And we need to be a lot better at this. And I would really encourage governments through their NDC and transition planning processes, and some are, like the Australian government's new Net Zero Transition Authority is very place-based and locally focused. I encourage governments and businesses to follow that model. Thank you.
Thank you. And just before I move to Carlo, just to encourage people to use the Q&A if they've got any questions for the panel. But Carlo, picking up that point around stakeholder engagement, and John talked about how, say, mining companies have been doing this for years, because it's pretty obvious when you're digging holes in the ground.
They've done it well, Moira, but they have done.
I said they've done it, and so there is a fairly well-established path on that for that sector. But thinking about telecommunications companies, where your millions of customers, multiple jurisdictions. How do you think about stakeholder engagement? And then also, perhaps you could also pick up this point, Carlo, about, because I'm very conscious that we're often, when we're talking about these frameworks, we're thinking about big companies that have been thinking about human rights for many years. What lessons can there be? And Peter, maybe you can touch on this as well. What lessons and where do you start? Where would you recommend people who are working in smaller organizations start on this? And in fact, is it the point that John was saying, that you start small and local and build out? But Carlo, maybe some reflections from you, please.
Yeah. Maybe first on the stakeholder identification and engagement part. Two reflections actually. First, on the identification part, I think this is really important also to understand that stakeholder mapping from a human rights perspective might require a different approach to what we typically take in stakeholder mapping, while in human rights, stakeholder mapping focuses on the risk of the right holders. Often typical stakeholder mapping focuses on the risk to the business. So in human rights stakeholder mapping, special attention is given to those stakeholders. If I try to visualize it, in the bottom right corner of a 2x2 influence impact matrix of stakeholders. So these vulnerable and marginalized right holders that are categorized as having the least influence, yet are very highly impacted by the business activity. And examples of the telecommunications industry, there are many. For example, people living in remote and rural areas without, let's say, broadband connectivity. They're not very well organized, and so they have less influence, but highly impacted by our business activity or lack of that business activity in these areas. And the same goes also for children in the digital world. So I think this is important to understand that the stakeholder identification part is key, and we have to take a slightly different view from a human rights perspective. Second thought on the stakeholder engagement. So once you have actually identified your stakeholders and right holders, is that as also was said earlier, you need real engagement. It must be your impact assessments should be informed by real engagement with people. And because what I see as a trend also recently is that it is based on big data media screening, which is often offered by platforms, consultancies, etc. So I think this cannot be the solution. It should be, as we already discussed now, if you mentioned a few times, it should be a bottom-up, location-based, and it should be based on real engagement with people. On your second question, where to start when you work on these issues within a company. I think what always is a good point to start are like networks, be it within your sector or even cross-sector initiatives at the national, international level, where you can get some good guidance on how to practically address these issues also within your company. This brings me also to a point which was alluded to earlier, the issue of where governments can also help, because what we see in our sector is that we as a company, as an individual company, we can only have a limited impact, to be very honest. We need some systemic change, and this is possible if you collaborate with other actors from business, government, civil society, etc. And we try to do so, at least within our sector, in business associations. We have a sector initiative, for example, the Joint Audit Corporation, where we as telcos work together to jointly have a positive impact. But here, often this comes this comes in conflict also with competition law. Yeah? So there is also an interesting consideration as to at least we feel that we must really be careful on where we can cooperate with other telcos, with other peers to address some of the more important societal challenges due to competition law. There might be also a hint for also regulators to have that in mind when passing new regulation. But yeah, maybe this as a not so quick response to your questions.
Thank you, Carlo. And I think both we've had a question in chat about what more can policymakers do to support business. And I think both you and Peter have called out in particular the importance of clarity on creating law to drive that change, to force companies to think about issues if they're not already doing so, but also to clarify existing laws and supporting collaborative efforts. I think, John, whether there's any additional reflection from you on that question about policymakers' role.
Yeah, final thoughts from me, really. I mean, the thing that makes me happy at the moment is being in rooms of bankers. And I never thought I'd ever say that in my whole life, but there's a lot of people in the financial community that know this change is inevitable and the money is beginning to go to the longer term sustainable investments. But we have two fundamental challenges for policymakers, I think. One is the pace of change. The change is too slow, right? We know that. And there are a lot of people who are shorting the system, populist politicians, or I would say short-term business models that operate off arbitrage and make money out of energy crisis and food crisis and all these other things. We've got to find a way of disincentivizing the short-term players in this. And the second challenge is bringing everyone with us. Huge numbers of vulnerable people around the world who have very little to responsibility for the climate change we face, and yet they're going to be amongst the biggest victims. So just transition, finding ways that that we carry everyone with us in this process and that we come out of it with a fairer society than we went in is absolutely crucial too for policymakers as well. So I think I worry less about business to some extent, and actually I think the change is happening in business and in financial markets. I worry more in public policy that it's too slow and we're dividing people and not uniting people around the transition ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. So we're coming close to time now, and I just wanted to thank the panel very much for their contributions. I think some of the key things that I've heard in terms of policy is that we need swift, coherent and clear regulations to help create change, but that in itself is not going to be enough. We need the bottom up and the top down thinking from corporates. A third point was learning from existing processes like industries that have been doing, looking at stakeholder engagement and local context for a while, but also building new ones and building collaborations. And most importantly, probably of all, this need for stakeholder engagement and local context. So with that, thank you very much for your time today and your important reflections. And I will hand back to the ICC. Thank you.
Thanks, Moira, and thanks ever so much for everyone for taking the time to do this for us today. All the sessions are going to be made available next week, so if you weren't able to attend days 1 or days 2, don't worry, we'll be making all of the recordings available next week. Thanks once again to our sponsors, ESG 360 and Halion, and we'll be in touch soon. Thanks ever so much, everyone. Bye.
Yeah.